Hey, good morning. Welcome to day 2 of my quarantine book log project. So I want to talk about The White Album by Joan Didion. This is one of my favorite books. It's an essay collection. When I first read this, I was really blown away by just the way that, so Joan Didion is a journalist and she's affiliated with the New Journalism movement, which is basically just sort of like personal essays that try to capture the like essence of a subject instead of just sort of going through the fact by fact kind of thing. And when I read this, I was like totally blown away because I was like, I didn't know you were allowed to write nonfiction like this. Like it reads like a novel. But anyway, so it starts, it comes right out. The first essay, The White Album, this is one of my favorite essays of all time. So I just want to spend a little time talking about this essay. She starts out saying, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." So basically this is, I'm talking here about a time when I began to doubt the premises of all the stories I ever told myself. This essay takes place in 1968. It's written about 10 years later. And she, at the time, Didion was like sort of a rich and successful woman about town. She's writing for Vogue. She just got named LA Times Woman of the Year. She's traveling a lot in LA, New York, Sacramento, and Honolulu. Her husband is a film producer. They're sort of like living in these big Hollywood mansions where there's people in and out. And then basically and then 1968 happens. And then she cuts to a psych evaluation of herself. Patient has alienated herself almost entirely from the world of other human beings. It is as though she feels deeply that all human effort is foredoomed to failure. A conviction which seems to push her further into a dependent passive withdrawal. In her view, she lives in a world of people moved by strange, conflicted, poorly comprehended, and above all devious motivations which commit them inevitably to conflict and failure. And then she says, so this is she gets this evaluation after what she calls an attack of vertigo and nausea. I think it's very possible that that's actually what this was, but having read a little bit more about her and read one of her novels that was kind of autobiographical, I think this very well could have been like a suicide attempt or an OD or something like that. But in any case, she says, by way of comment, I offer only that an attack of vertigo and nausea does not seem to be an inappropriate response to the summer of 1968. So this is a totally incredible way to start an essay. This is like a cold open, and then the rest of it, she's sort of going scene by scene to various things that she experienced and saw in 1968. Because remember, she's a journalist. She's going around with a writing pad, just sort of interviewing famous people, being in interesting sort of like powerful spaces, and reporting on them. And it's all taking place sort of under this, nothing actually happens in this essay. She doesn't report on anything being sort of any events. It's just trying to create like an air or sort of like this malaise that's seems to be settled over the whole country. Everyone is sort of like, there's like death in the air. There's like a lot of hope, and that hope has been like crushed. And so ultimately this whole book is about 1968, right? So in this essay, again, it's like 10 years later, and she's looking back and sort of reflecting more honestly on what she was going through at the time. But then the rest of the essays in the collection is a really well curated collection, because the rest of them sort of were written in 1968 or around 1968. So then you get to read what she was actually reporting at the time when she was having this sort of panic attack and dissociation from society and from everything she'd grown up with. Before I go into that, I just want to do a little bit of historical context about 1968, right? Because this book is about a very particular time. It's called The White Album. So obviously there's 1968. I knew like right off the bat, MLK gets assassinated and Robert Kennedy gets assassinated while he's running for president. But I just did a little bit more research before recording this, and 1968 was an insane fucking year. So you already, throughout the 60s, you have a bunch of like strikes, workers, unions, protests, student movements, all that kind of stuff. And it's really like, it's not, people holding little cards that have puns on them. This is like people, like working people, black people, students gaining physical and political power through collective action. The student movements, students actually like kidnapped their deans and held them hostage until policies were passed. And the policies that got passed in response to that were basically like letting black people into colleges mostly. There were different concessions in different places for sure, but sort of the at the time, universities other than HBCUs, universities were still I think pretty much entirely white unless you're like literally W.E.B. Du Bois or someone. But these student protests and these movements sort of pulled the power back. Anyway, what's this all a response to? Vietnam, the war in Vietnam is endless, and now we're carpet bombing Laos and Cambodia for absolutely no reason. And the Black Panthers, so I mean, there's a bunch of black radical movements rising up right now because Jim Crow is still the law of the land. Black people can't vote in most parts of the country. Like literally legally it says that they can vote, but the white people who are controlling the elections just don't let them vote. So, a bunch of movements are happening. MLK is rising, Malcolm X is rising, and the Black Panther movement is, and she actually talks about it later in this essay. But basically, there's like black militants, that's what they call them, just like armed and in the streets trying to build an army to threaten white rule. Because remember, at the time, really like the country is under complete white rule. Black people cannot vote except in certain circumstances. And so it's not just like a little difference of policies here and there. It's like white people are still like really running the country completely unchecked in any way. And the narrative of 1968, right, there's an election happening. And so it starts out, you have in January, there's the Tet Offensive, which is an action in Vietnam that just like basically it like goes ape shit. So Tet is the Vietnam, like the local New Year. And like everyone's celebrating, drinking, whatever, and then the U.S. Army just comes in and like napalm, carpet bombing, like murdering civilians, like horrifying stuff. And this is being broadcast live on national television, and people are seeing it. And so there's huge anti-war protests. And Johnson, the Democrat president, who took over after JFK got assassinated, he is the orchestrator. He's like really in charge of this increase in the war in Vietnam. So there's huge pressure on him. On the Democrats to run someone else, right? So the anti-war groups are pushing people like Robert Kennedy, who's, he says some like anti-war things, but of course he's still supporting the president because he's a Democrat. They're telling all these people to get into the race and to compete with Johnson for the re-election, but Robert Kennedy says no. And then finally, Eugene McCarthy, if you don't know who that is, that's like a good person to know about. Eugene McCarthy does get into the race. He says he runs as an anti-war campaign against LBJ. And he has the support of all the student movements. He's kind of like, whatever, like the Bernie equivalent figure in this election. He then gets 40% of the vote in a primary. I think it's like the New Hampshire primary or something. It's 50% for Johnson, 40% for McCarthy, and that's like the sitting president of the United States is getting like almost beaten by this kind of like radical anti-war candidate. So now shit gets real. RFK, Robert Kennedy, gets into the race after saying he wasn't going to challenge the president, and Johnson drops out. Johnson says, I'm not going to seek re-election anymore. So now it's like, what's going to happen? Are we going to have this radical Eugene McCarthy? Or are we going to have this like Robert F. Kennedy, this sort of like repeat of JFK? And then it's really looking like it might be Kennedy sort of as this like intermediate thing. And then MLK gets assassinated in April. And then Robert Kennedy gets assassinated in June. So now it really seems like Eugene McCarthy is the only one left. Also, like the Southern Democrats, by the way, are getting behind George Wallace, who's this like white supremacist segregationist. Because remember, the Democratic Party at the time is still like there's a bunch of people. It's like a lot of the white South is still Democrat, and they're very anti. Eugene McCarthy is like really pushing everything to the left. So you have a bunch of the sort of like white racist people in the South are now pulling away to George Wallace. George Wallace later on, so then there's like a battle essentially in Chicago. There's the convention is in Chicago, the DNC convention is in Chicago, mass protests, people come in from all over, and who ends up getting the nomination? Hubert Humphrey, who was not running. So he was running. I mean, from where we're sitting, from what, like, how shit works in 2020, he was not running. He was just running in the caucuses. So remember, like, most of the states, or a lot of the states, are still caucuses at this time, where it's just like rich white dudes in rooms casting ballots, and there's like 12 of them. And Hubert Humphrey, because he's like a party boss. He's like friends of LBJ. He's the one that LBJ is supporting. He's like an establishment Democrat, and they just go around and get all of the, establishment Democrats to cast their ballots for him. He is not running in the primaries. That's like how this thing is so wild. Eugene McCarthy got by far the most votes, and then Robert F. Kennedy is second for the most votes, and Hubert Humphrey literally was not running. What they did instead, when there were primaries in a couple states like Ohio, Florida, whatever, there were primaries, and they just ran local people. So they got a senator from Florida to run, they got a senator from Ohio to run, who was the favorite son thing. And then those people would get whatever 30-40% of the vote, and then they would cast those delegates for Hubert Humphrey instead. So basically they just stole the nomination in like a very open, flagrant sense, and violence and riots break out at the convention in Chicago. And then Humphrey is the nominee. He's kind of a not super compelling choice because no one really knows about him. And then they're running against Nixon, who obviously does some shady shit when it comes to elections. And then also George Wallace, the white racist Democrat dude from the South, runs third party, because even Humphrey, that's not good enough for them. And he wins 5 states in the South. So 3 parties win states, and then Nixon, by a teeny tiny hair, becomes president of the United States. I mean, obviously this election was rigged because black people couldn't vote, or a lot of black people couldn't vote, even though the Voting Rights Act had just been passed. There was obvious voter suppression, the drug war was ramping up, and just violence in the streets everywhere, like a lot of suppression of people and labor in general. Oh, I think it should also be said, MLK got assassinated when he was in Memphis for a strike, for a sanitation worker strike. So labor was rising up, and MLK was part of that. He was a radical who wanted dramatic change to the institutions of the United States. Okay, I'm getting way too deep into the history here. But basically, after all this happens, the White Album is released in November of 1968. And I just think that that's kind of a funny contrast, and that's what this book is really about, is kind of what were these rich white liberals up to while all this shit was going down, where we were in a real genuine revolutionary seeming moment before it gets crushed by Nixon and sort of the Nixon revolutionary administration. And what was going on in in Joan Didion's circles. So the rest of this essay, which is really fantastic, and I recommend reading it, talks about it. So she interviews the star witness for the prosecution in the Manson murders, and the person she interviews says, everything was to teach me something. And that's a crazy thing to say about the Manson murders, right? That was such a really wild sequence of events. But anyway, Linda operated on what I later recognized as dice theory, and so during the years I'm talking about did I. So Joan is questioning the idea that everything happens for a reason. Basically, she thinks the world is just governed by chaotic random chance. This is one of my favorite scenes from this essay, is she's just sitting with a writing pad at the Doors recording studio, and she said, okay, I had already heard about acid as a transitional stage, and also about the Maharishi, and even about universal love, and after a while it all sounded like Marmalade Skies to me. So obviously this is about the Beatles and all these psychedelic rock bands who are radical love, man, we're gonna fix everything by playing sitars. And the Doors music, which was different, she says, the Doors music insisted that love was sex, and sex was death, and therein lay salvation. And then she quotes the lyrics. Come on, baby, gonna take a little ride, going down by the ocean side, gonna get real close, get real tight, baby gonna drown tonight, going down, down, down. This whole scene, she's just sitting there and nothing's happening, and it's hours and hours they're waiting for Jim Morrison to show up. And that's kind of the sort of the vibe of this whole essay. There's another one in here that I like. So this is about Huey Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, and he gets shot in 1967. This is a report from the nurse who found him. I heard a moaning, who obviously came to the hospital. I heard a moaning and a groaning, and I went over, and it was this Negro fellow was there. He had been shot in the stomach, and at the time he didn't appear in any acute distress, and so I said I'd see. And I asked him if he was a Kaiser, if he belonged to Kaiser. And he said, yes, get a doctor. Can't you see I'm bleeding? I've been shot. Now get someone out here. And I asked him if he had his Kaiser card, and he got upset at this, and he said, come on, get a doctor out here. I've been shot. She says, for a long time I kept a copy of this testimony pinned on my office wall on the theory that it illustrated a collision of cultures, a classic instance of a historical outsider confronting the established order at its most petty and impenetrable level. This theory was shattered when I learned that Huey Newton was in fact an enrolled member of the Kaiser Foundation Health Plan, i.e., in Nurse Leonard's words, a Kaiser. So you can just pause the video and ruminate on that one for a minute. She gives a list of what she packed when she was traveling to report, and I love this. You can read it. And the goal was to pass on either side of the culture, right? She wanted to either be able to be sort of like a hippie or sort of, she says she has a skirt, a leotard, and stockings. And also, this essay is the first essay in the book, and it's sort of raising all these questions, like what are the sides of the culture? I want to hear more about that. This is just a scene where she almost seems like she has like a nervous breakdown while she's driving across a bridge, and it's her sort of trying to hold it together and not drive off the bridge. This whole book is just like really dark and cynical, and I love that because I am in a dark, cynical place. I'm going to just cover a couple more essays. This book is really, there's so much going on here. There's a couple essays of just her reporting. Oh, the thing paused, one sec. There's a bunch of just her reporting while she's going through this nervous breakdown, just reporting on like the water system in California and like these bureaucrats at the LA highway department or whatever. There's stuff about museums. I just want to skip to some of the politics stuff, which I really like. This is my other favorite essay in the book, is Good Citizens. Also recommend reading. This one's shorter. It's just a 3-part instead of a 13-part. Yeah. Okay. So, Good Citizens. This is basically like how rich white liberals talk about politics during this time where, again, shit is going down. So she's in Hollywood with a bunch of rich people, and so she says politics are not widely considered a legitimate source of amusement in Hollywood, where the borrowed rhetoric by which political ideas are reduced to choices between the good, equality is good, and the bad, genocide is bad, tends to make even the most casual political talk, small talk, resemble a rally. So she's talking about all these sort of, they're eating their fraise de bois and talking about how no man is an island and solidarity and all this stuff. What a sacrifice on the altar of nationalism. So she's just like really reading all these people who she's hanging out with in this time. It's a way of talking that tends to preclude further discussion, which may well be its intention. And then she talks about, this is really funny, so Eugene's was a club, a bunch of clubs that were opened up by supporters of Eugene McCarthy. And she's talking about the Eugenes in Beverly Hills, which is just a funny concept already. So the Beverly Hills Eugenes, not unlike Senator McCarthy's campaign itself, had a certain deja vu to it, a glow of 1952 humanism. And then she describes the stuff, which obviously I don't get any of these cultural references, but you can kind of guess. The music was not 1968 rock, but the kind of jazz people used to have on their record players when everyone who believed in the family of man bought Scandinavian stainless steel flatware and voted for Adlai Stevenson. Sure, okay. But she sets the scene really nicely. And then the way she feels that Hollywood people talk about politics is basically like they're talking about a screenplay. So social problems present themselves to many of these people in terms of a scenario in which, once certain key scenes are licked, the confrontation on the courthouse steps, the revelation that the opposition leader has an anti-Semitic past, the presentation of the bill of particulars, the process will proceed inexorably to an upbeat fade. Marlon Brando does not picket Sam Quentin in vain. What we are talking about here is a faith in dramatic convention. Things happen. There's always a resolution. So, again, 1968, all of this movement was happening. All of these people were fighting for all of these changes. And then it ends with Nixon getting elected. So. Then this is an amazing scene. She's interviewing or reporting on Nancy Reagan, who at the time, Reagan is governor of California, I think. Yeah, governor of California. And so there's also a television crew there. So the television crew The television crew wanted to watch her while she was doing precisely what she would normally be doing on a Tuesday at home, since I was also there to watch her doing precisely what she would ordinarily be doing on a Tuesday at home. We seem to be on the verge of exploring certain media frontiers. The television, it's just like this ridiculous, like, what are we going to talk about? What is the, like, meat of the substance here? And then it's just watching the TV newsman sort of like set up all of these little scenes. Can you clip these rhododendrons? Okay, would you be doing that? And just like directing the scene. Nipping a bud. Let's have a dry run, the cameraman said. In other words, by a dry run, you mean you want her to fake nipping the bud? Fake the nip, the cameraman said. Fake the nip. And that's the whole thing. Again, you can theorize about what that means. This is really a beautiful one. So this is now, she's at the JC's meeting. I didn't know what those were, but my understanding based on this essay is it's kind of like a young professionals luncheon. These are like the people kind of like, like Evan Peters' character in Pose, or like the people who grew up into being Jack Donaghy, or like Donald Trump, or Ron Swanson, or whatever. And so you have, she just describes the scene really well. It's like this dreary day in Santa Monica, rain is falling, there's like, you can sort of see the steam coming off of these like houses, and it's like, the 60s have just happened, and it seems like the world is dying and everything is different and crazy, and you have these sort of like cheerful guys in suits and tuxes with all their wives, and there's a medley of George M. Cohan music, whoever that is. To my left, another delegate was urging me to ask every man in the room how the JCs had changed his life. I asked, it saved my marriage and built my business, he whispered. You could find 1,000 inspirational stories right here at this president's luncheon. The new generation marched into supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. The woman is sobbing into a pink napkin. It's just a really cool way of writing, I think. So the ideology going on here, that she sort of observes here, is an idea that she says is shared by almost all the people in America's small cities and towns, and it's this idea of business as a transcendent ideal, business success as divinity, basically. They look at the underdeveloped world, quote unquote underdeveloped, as a temporarily depressed area, mainly in need of people-to-people programs. And they're trying to figure out how to convince everyone to get on board with their vision at a time when, quote, so much of America seems to be looking at the negative. At first I thought I had walked out of the rain into a time warp. The 60s seemed not to have happened. All these JCs were by definition between 21 and 35 years old, but there was a disquieting tendency among them to have settled foursquare into middle age. There was the heavy jocularity, the Baroque rhetoric of another generation entirely, a kind of poignant attempt to circumnavigate social conventions that had in fact broken down in the 20s. Wives were lovely and forbearing. Getting together for drinks was having a cocktail reception. Rain was liquid sunshine, and the choice of a table for dinner was making an executive decision. Here were some people who had been led to believe that the future was always a rational extension of the past. They found themselves not merely shocked, but personally betrayed by recent history. It was supposed to have been their time. It was not. Oh my gosh. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about in this book is one of the last essays called On the Morning After the 60s. And this is kind of not really a thesis statement, because I gather her thesis is kind of just being like, everything is futile. Well, I guess that is her thesis. Is basically that like we're all doomed to horrors and death, and there's no use in anything, and people are bad, and things happen by chance and chaos. So she says, I'm talking here about being a child of my time. She kind of missed the 60s, right? She was already a professional writer when the hippie movement was coming up. The distance we have come from the world in which I went to college in the 50s. She went to Berkeley in the 50s, which is kind of funny because Berkeley in the 60s is where like a bunch of shit went down. So the distance we come from the world in which I went to college, she describes the scene of like from her college, and it's like very 50s feeling. And it seems like even in the 60s, kind of like, or I think she's writing this in 1970, but not that long later, the whole thing seems like a super distant alien past. So clearly some of these social movements were successful, right? So she's kind of defending her sort of like inactivity in the 50s, and she says, at Berkeley in the 50s, no one was surprised by anything at all. We were silent because the exhilaration of social action seemed to many of us just one more way of escaping the personal, of masking for a while that dread of the meaningless which was man's fate. So she's saying, I didn't get involved in any of these protests because we're all going to die anyway. And it seems like getting involved in protests is just a way to try to make yourself immortal, which I think is fair. I think a lot of people do it for that reason. And then she says she has professional success, right? So what I have made for myself is personal, but it is not exactly peace. Only one person I knew at Berkeley later discovered an ideology, dealt himself into history, cut himself loose from both his own dread and his own time. A few of the people I knew at Berkeley killed themselves not long after. Another attempted suicide in Mexico, and then, in a recovery which seemed in many ways a more advanced arrangement, came home and joined the Bank of America's 3-year executive training program. Most of us live less theatrically, but remain the survivors of a peculiar and inward time. If I could believe that going to a barricade would affect man's fate in the slightest, I would go to that barricade, and quite often I wish that I could, but it would be less than honest to say that I expect to happen upon such a happy ending. 1970. So, I think that's about that. I recommend reading the rest of this book. This is a really great piece of work, and it really captures the 60s, 1968 in particular. And I feel like it's super relevant to right now when I've been reading it. Again, it just feels super resonant. Yeah, so that's today.